Hello, my name is Paola Balla. I am a Wemba-Wemba and Gunditjmara sovereign woman, artist, curator, and academic. Welcome to my keynote, Sovereignty for Photo Ideas as part of Photo 2021. I acknowledge the place I am speaking from, the unceded sovereign lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri lands of the Greater Eastern Kulin Nation in so-called Melbourne, in so-called Victoria, in so-called Australia. My keynote will focus on Indigenous visual sovereignty in my visual work and the work of other First Nation women artists, and how we respond to, play with, resist and subvert and speak back in black to photography and its colonial use as a tool of documentary and of surveillance. Please note when I say black, I emphasise it's the black with the C dropped, as named by the legendary artist Destiny Deacon in Melbourne in 1994 in the iconic exhibition Blackness, Black City Culture at ACCA, curated by Hetty Perkins and Claire Williamson. By taking up Deacon's black, I continue to disrupt the status quo of those who shy away from the big C word that Destiny spoke back to, as she recalled her and her siblings being called little black cunts by white people as children in Melbourne. In using and recognising Deacon's black, we are positioning the power of blackness and black women's power as sovereign warrior women and people. I am a Wemba-Wemba cisgendered woman who goes by she or her and belong to the Wemba-Wemba tribal group and families and community of Wemba-Wemba Nation, and live in the western suburbs of Melbourne, and I'm a proud member of the Aboriginal community here. I'm also Gunditjmara through my patriarchal line, but as Wemba-Wemba, we are matriarchal and sovereign women first and foremost, and we follow our matriarchal line as part of my responsibility culturally. Before I begin to speak about what visual sovereignty is from my position, I need to speak about what sovereignty is for Indigenous peoples broadly, and specifically for Aboriginal peoples in so-called Australia. I speak specifically as a sovereign Wemba-Wemba person and not for any other. I'm also an artist, curator, academic and community member, and I won't begin to speak about visual sovereignty without positioning the history of Indigenous sovereignty for Wemba-Wemba peoples. In the excellent keynote given recently, titled Indigenous Visual Sovereignty by esteemed artist, curator and scholar Jolene Rickard of the Haudenosaunee Nation in the United States, known as United States, for the Power Institute. Jolene gave a background of what sovereignty is from her standpoint and expanded in question time with Aboriginal art scholar Stephen Gilchrist and curator that when working with neo-colonial cultural institutions, we need to remind them that the fantasy that we were captured and colonised is still a fantasy in the colonised state, that they fail to understand that, quote, we are a future and that our way of understanding how to be in this world has brought us to the place that we're at. In considering this post-apocalyptic bushfire and pandemic place, also this global place of pandemic, and in all the inequitable ways it adversely affects Indigenous peoples in the so-called United States and Black and Brown communities, I acknowledge that I sit in relative safety and well-being from the pandemic because of the efforts and professionalism and care of Aboriginal community health workers and activists, first and foremost. I acknowledge that we have never ceded our sovereignty as Wemba-Wemba peoples, and I think of my unbroken line of Wemba-Wemba matriarchs who I belong to. As Jolene says, her nation's sister clans had the US and Canadian settler borders placed upon them through their lands, and our Wemba-Wemba lands were also impacted through state settler impositions. These included being moved off our unbroken thousands of years of occupation and nurturing of Wemba-Wemba country, and being forcibly moved onto a mission named Munakala, which in our language, which was deemed a reserve from 1896 until 1962. Munakala operated as a government-run reserve administered by the Aborigines Inland Mission. The mission school was established in 1911, gazetted and then revoked in 1964. In 1898, the cemetery was established and our people continue to be buried and cared for there and live there and visit there and hunt and fish and care for country there. By 1941, mission managers were appointed by the state government to take over running of the mission. In protest at this oppressive, racist treatment of our people, my great-grandparents, Nancy Egan, Nee Day, a Wemba-Wemba woman, Robert Wallace Egan, a Gunditjmara, a man of the Fighting Mara, of Framlingham Mission, left Moonacolour with their 10 children and made their way to Echuca in the Order country, and were forced to leave Wemba-Wemba homelands for the first time in history. This caused a fracture in our lives, but not an ending of our sovereignty. A wave of community reoccupation of Wemba country took place from the 1970s after the mission was flattened by settlers, and returning families took up life once again, rebuilding little homes. I was taken there as a child growing up with my brother and cousins, my brother and sister cousins for camping, family trips, aunties and uncles, grandmother, and my mum, of course, hunting, fishing, swimming and learning in the same places that our Wemba-Wemba peoples had for hundreds of generations before us. The places where we camped corresponded to the positioning of the original mission houses, including where each family group had negotiated their positions. The original mission houses are the very embodiment of surviving colonialism through built visual sovereignty. In these small houses and mission buildings, a schoolhouse, church and store were all built from found materials and mud bricks from Wemba-Wemba riverbanks and the Collagen River and Tamudgery Creek that were built by aunties and uncles long gone. Homes had one room, wooden framed, with compacted dirt floors that were kept meticulously clean by sprinkling with water and brushing with gum leaf brooms. The walls would be insulated with old newspapers. Their light was lantern or candle. There was no electricity or heating other than stoves added later. I grew up in Aboriginal housing in the 1980s, managed by white officers where we paid to rent to live on other Aboriginal nations' lands. When curating these homes, my mother and grandmother and aunties asserted family culture, history and genealogy through photography. Photographs take on a high significance in Aboriginal culture as they testify to the genealogies and survival of our people despite colonisation, and the rarity of these photographs speaks to the poverty they endured through the rarity and scarcity of cameras themselves and of getting film developed. Images taken by family and community flip the colonial, predominantly white male gaze in historic photography of Aboriginal peoples. Such experiences of home and the sovereign and the survived drive my ontological approach to curation and art making. My epistemological approaches are a more explicit representation of Aboriginal women's knowledges passed down and remade, our legacies of practice, art, of making, asserting matriarchal sovereignty, both born into and reclaimed through multiple actions, including researchable artistic creation. This also performs as a speaking black. To paraphrase Bell Hooks, and to paraphrase the White Cube and Professor Aileen Morton Robinson's seminal text, Talking Up to the White Woman, subverting the dominant whiteness of gallery spaces. In speaking back to the White Cube of the dominant artistic terra nullius, so called by Cook and others, an invasion to our shores, as this was not a no man's land. Our esteemed Wemba-Wemba matriarch and my great-great-grandmother, Papa Murray J, was moved from her place onto the mission site, forcing her from her sovereign position on the Tamudgery Creek, a women's place, and disrespecting her sovereignty but not destroying it. In fact, remembering stories and facts of dispersal, otherwise known as genocide, are ways of maintaining our unceded sovereignty as Wemba-Wemba peoples, and the fact that the settler state still has no treaty with us. Also, current negotiations with the developing, however stalled, Victorian state government treaty neglect to include Wemba-Wemba peoples at all, as we are not a registered Aboriginal party, and state politics and colonial borders play a part and leave us stateless in a sense. We stand alone and unrepresented, but also sovereign from this flawed process that has embodied state-sanctioned colonial ways of doing things. We remain, as Wemba-Wemba peoples, still being, doing and knowing who we are. As Jolene Rickard said, her people, the Haudenosaunee, have maintained their sovereignty through epistemological ways of being in the world, so have we as Wemba-Wemba. Jolene also spoke of our success at being Indigenous, and that the colonial fantasy is that we are all, as Indigenous peoples, captured and colonised, which she refuted, as do I, and that we certainly interrupt that with our art, as she said. My coming into being as an artist and a curator, researcher, and writer are ways that I express my sovereignty into the public realm of dialogue, place, and being. I'd like to share an excerpt from my PhD thesis, which I completed during the lockdowns of 2020 and submitted at the end of October 2020. It's a little meditation on the power of visual sovereignty as created by Black women artists and scholars. In the video work of artist and scholar Dr. Ray Saunders, Pulls Apart from 2009, we witness the artist run through the bush in a Black colonial era Victoriana gown, its high collar hiding her body with her face and head exposed to the horrorscape enveloping her. She runs as a sovereign warrior. Encased in black taffeta, she relentlessly moves. Odette Carter wrote of this, referencing the escape her own grandmother and grandmother's sister's attempt from their forced removal to return home. This conspicuous appropriation of colonial styles of female dress to confront histories of violence and domestic labour is a compelling reminder of the power dynamics that have existed and continue to exist between white women and Aboriginal women. Through the use of her body here, Ray makes an indelible statement on the intersections of race and gender. The dress, as an introduced colonial object, can also be read as a skin white women enforced on the body of Aboriginal women to domesticate and so-called civilise us during colonial dispersal, genocide, and dispossession. In early colonial art, the image of Aboriginal women morphs from the fringe-dwelling lubra, very ugly term, with an ever-present empty alcohol bottle placed at our feet, our possum skin quotes replaced by wretched, itchy, and pox-infected colonial blankets. In early photography, we begin to see her, us, me, more commonly covered in Victoriana-era gowns, in mission and reserve life photographs, and eventually white wedding gowns on mission church steps, beside besuited, handsome Aboriginal men. Sometimes we are posed with caught between two worlds, in colonial-era photographic studios by voyeuristic photographic vultures, creating ongoing false images and legacies of ethnocentricity, sometimes posed on bicycles, sometimes felled trees, kangaroo and possum skins incorrectly draped over us, the colonial garments taken from us, breasts once again bare, in a curated bizarre return to our natural state. The colonial photographers document us reenacting ourselves and people in a living diorama. She, we, stare into the lens, looking away simultaneously. She, we, do not allow the white male photographer to own her with his lens. She stares through it into us, waiting in the colonised future for her return and demanding we see the real her. The artist, photographer and filmmaker Genevieve Greaves in her series Mission Voices spoke back with a fierce, quiet determination that returned Aboriginal women and men to disrupting the white colonial gaze from these legacies into short films, each one a celebration of resistance and self-knowledge. Aboriginal women's colonial attire becomes more commonplace in the colony's depiction of us, most commonly seen in ugly, dehumanising, racist cartoons, only ever depicting us or placing us on the fringes, on our knees, in an apron, subservient, or broken, ugly, weak, drunk, or as sluts. Babies or small children are often posed with us on heaps or on the very ground we're usually depicted on. This historically cements us to the notion of being equivalent to dirt, unhuman and undeserving of respect or dignity. Our worth becomes determined by sexual availability to men, for manual labour for white women and white men and little else. Our freedom and rights must be constantly bargained for or pleaded for. This degradation of our authority and rights continues to haunt and trails Aboriginal women into the present, in which we are still fighting against being raped, bashed, murdered, disappeared, arrested, jailed, becoming a death in custody, having our children removed. We're fighting for the rights of our grandchildren and their removal. The historical and colonial injuries to the way we are perceived, treated, and generationally traumatised feels depressingly permanent. In Aboriginal women's art and photography, we see resistance, defiance, beauty, sovereignty. The Black woman in the black dress in Pulls Apart runs with strength and purpose from the horrors of the stolen generation and her own matriarch suffering. The dress becomes an object of enforced Western gender norms with invasion and colonial interference. I'm reminded of my grandmother's resistance to being forced to wear bras and underwear. She'd say to me, "Take them off, bub, they're no good for you." My grandmother teaches me that our health and freedom and sovereignty are dependent on each other. These restrictions introduced to the black woman's body is beautifully subverted, played with and owned by artists like Diane Jones and her version of Audrey Hepburn, all cool and slinky in a slinky little black dress. Tracy Moffat's body wrapped in Chinese cheongsams in the Never Never Stilted landscape, where she stares off from the series Something More. Destiny Deepens play on Frida Kahlo, Virginia's doll, sees her celebrating herself and Frida at home on her couch, where her dreams, laughter, and loves gather around her with their little black rescue dolls somewhere in the background. Stars of other photo shoots, all trapped and wrapped in little dresses, destined and decided for the girl child. The running woman in Ree's video runs alongside me in my dreams, and she's there to make sure I wake up okay. Aboriginal women in ripped dresses and little girls in white mission frocks, waiting to be picked out by white women for their servitude, haunts me. In the 1980s, my grandmother, comfortable and cool in her jeans and Ugg boots, smiles at me and winks. Nan joins the body of Aboriginal women artist warriors who spur me on, showing me the way, not just inspiring, but giving me life. They demonstrate sovereignty. They demonstrate the unspoken, the unresolved, the silenced and the feared, and they disrupt everything that pins us down and smothers our sovereign mouths. In the colonial context, little is known of Indigenous sovereignty, as white descriptions and allusions to sovereignty are usually of protecting Australia's sovereign borders and racist exploitative shows on Channel 7 spying on international arrivals. The conversation is dominated about who the white and assimilated nation decides is worthy of being Australian. Recent examples of this are the long-term incarcerations of refugees in Melbourne and in Australia's notorious offshore processing centres, jails like the colonially named Christmas Island. This stems from Australia's very recent past of the White Australia policy, a set of historical racial policies that aim to forbid people of non-European ethnic origin, especially Asian people and Pacific Islanders, Pacifica peoples, from immigrating to Australia, starting in 1901 and only ending in 1973, a year before I was born, when the then Whitlam government definitively renounced the White Australia policy and established a policy of multiculturalism. And of course, the assimilation policy, which led to the stealing of Aboriginal children, the stolen generation and ongoing removals of Aboriginal children from their families and communities, which continues. Policy interferes with Aboriginal sovereignty. Sovereignty and Indigenous sovereignty is little understood in mainstream Australia, and this is no more obvious than in our schools, universities and art schools, where Aboriginal history and cultural studies are optional in almost all cases. In primary and secondary schools in Australia, Indigenous perspectives are on an option in the national curriculum, and out of the required standards to be taught in schools, where there are 2 Indigenous standards, but no guide provided on how to implement them, and they are emphasised as optional. Aboriginal elders, organisers and activists have been calling for this to be changed for decades now. Aboriginal experiences of schooling are often alienating, depressing, anxiety-causing, disconnecting times for Aboriginal students. It was for me, and unfortunately it has been for my 25-year-old daughter, and the same experience is taking place for my 16-year-old son. I do have hope though when I see young Aboriginal people themselves educating themselves in their communities, by their communities, out of the school system, which they essentially have to survive. And through family history, genealogy, and reading Indigenous literature, scholarship, research, learning about Aboriginal art and artists and the legacy of their contribution to the cultural landscape of this country, and blowing up social media with their activism and platforms, these become digital spaces of truth-telling and visual sovereignty, of proudly stating pride in Aboriginal and Blackness, and asserting and stating pride in Black beauty and Indigenous beauty, where images of themselves have been erased or denied previously. I lecture a unit called the Politics of Aboriginal Art at Victoria University in our Indigenous academic unit in Balla, where I'm part of a team of Aboriginal lecturers, activists, creatives, artists, philosophers, thinkers and doers. Sovereignty is in action in this space. Visual Indigenous sovereignty for me is taught through listening, doing and being to reach the knowing. concept of Indigenous knowing, doing and being was termed by Professor Karen Martin, Quandamooka scholar from so-called Queensland. During my PhD research, my associate supervisor, Professor Tracy Bunter, urged me to maintain and assert my sovereignty and reasoning for pursuing a PhD, particularly one in practice-led visual research, by telling me that we must find places of unconditional love. I believe that these places are where we find wellsprings to strengthen our sovereignty when we are in sites of colonial power like universities, galleries, and museums. Asserting visual sovereignty is a form of empowerment for Indigenous wellbeing and healing from ongoing colonial injuries and surviving ongoing colonialism. One of the most explicit representations of visual sovereignty in my work is in the Mukmuk photographic series, which was shown in the Affirmation exhibition at the Koori Heritage Trust, part of Photo 2020. It's where I pose as a Black domestic goddess cook in a suburban kitchen, preparing to eat emu egg chocolate cake, gluten-free of course, by sliding a bone-handled butter knife across her tongue, and licking the chocolate icing whilst glaring into the camera lens, and where she's smashing cake into her mouth, letting the crumbs of icing fall where it will. These were followed by titles Washing Day Sis, Graduation Day, I Woke Up Like This, and Mukmuk the Matriarch. Mukmuk was an ancestral spiritual woman from Wemba-Wemba country who I was told about as a little girl, and the esteemed elder and author Annie Marge Tucker wrote about in her autobiography, If Everyone Cared, from 1977. In addition to family albums and photographs holding visual memory and remembrance, the very peoples who embody our sovereignty, our families, our old people, our ancestors, there's also written artifacts that complete these archives. Completing this body of work for me was a handwritten poem, Childhood Memories, from 1988 by my grandmother, Rosa Tang, which was published twice in the Claiborne Free Press of 1988 and the Sydney Book Review in 2020. My mother protected and saved this handwritten document, which I had enlarged and printed and installed in my PhD thesis exhibition. I'm grateful for my grandmother's contribution to this archive. She died at 64 years of age, around the life expectancy for an Aboriginal woman in this colony. The poem speaks of the traumas of colonisation. It speaks of the starvation and hunger pains that she, like so many of our elders, endured because of invasion and genocide. I created my PhD ethics poster of the creative work featuring archival images of our Wemba-Wemba old people and relatives from Moonacolour Mission to cite our place as central to my standpoint, responsibility and respect to homeland's people and sovereignty. It became a visual sovereignty map for guiding my ethics work in the research. Cascading down the left-hand side of my face in the poster are images of myself, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and great-great-grandmother. And next to each matriarch, I placed lines of text from Wilson Shire about the magic that grandmother's hands spin, gold from nothing, goodness and nourishment from impoverishment, as featured in Beyonce's seminal Lemonade album of 2016. Lovescapes of Wemba-Wemba Country 2017 is a work from my PhD research that embodies a sense of relationality as named by Professor Morton Robinson in 2013 as a lived experience represented in the genealogical use of photography in responding to country and to visually represent sovereignty. By printing the photographic images of my matriarchs on translucent film, with then positioning the foreground of Wemba-Wemba Country, I aim to demonstrate the relationship between my matriarchs, myself, my daughter, and my country. These works grew out of a longer-term photographic practice, resulting in the epistemological space of photography, documentation, and active research with family, the archive, and the theorised field of Aboriginal women's work. They visually represent our sovereignty as Wemba peoples. The epistemological works I do are a replication of my conceptual thinking, my working space from the critical place of the interpretation and documentation, and the ontological works express my processes of going deep within my embodied memories of place, country, and lived experiences of surviving and thriving in the face of colonisation, of asserting sovereignty. And I reflect on the healing process of my own traumas and intergenerational traumas. My work and the work that informs it are described as matriarchal and imbued with Aboriginal women's authority, and that of the sovereign warrior woman as named by Professor Bunter. A descendant of basket weavers and emu feather wearing women, guided by birds as totemic, My matriarchs are also poets, writers, painters, photographers, and activists. My great-great-grandmother, my Papa Murray Day, undertook a 1,500-kilometre round trip alone to represent our family and our Wemba people to attend the very first day of mourning in Sydney, January 26, 1938, in protest at the loss of lives of Aboriginal peoples and the invasion and genocide of Australia. The work of the Unbound Collective, in particular of Ali Baker, a mending woman from the Nullarbor, also a performer, filmmaker, and university lecturer, whose areas of research include colonial archives, memory, and intergenerational transmission of knowledge. Her photographic lightbox work, Sovereign Goddess, Not Domestic, numbers 1 and 2, honour and reference, as she says, the many Nunga women in our families who worked as unpaid domestics throughout their lives, in particular her own ancestors. Her Nana Ruby worked for 40 years as a domestic for a policeman without ever receiving a wage for her work. And my Nana May was sent to work as a domestic when she was 6 years old, Baker says. She says she also honours the many First Nation artists who continue to tell this history of servitude in their work, of matriarchies of storytelling, of resistance, of survival, and of continuance. We are giants of our histories. I'm very honoured that I've been able to be in exhibitions along with Ali. In Refusal to Forgive, Indigenous Women's Love and Rage, Les Glen scholar Rachel Flowers points out that for Indigenous women, often our love and positions we hold in the community make us targets of colonial violence. Ultimately, our resentment and anger are in response to the modes of gendered colonial violence that exploit our love. She deepens this point in describing those moments when we come together in protest or in remembrance for our sisters and brothers and non-binary relations. Our anger is not abandoned, our resentment is not relinquished. It is because of our profound love for one another and our lands that we are full of rage. Anger and love are not always mutually exclusive emotions. And in Critically Sovereign, Indigenous Gender, Sexuality and Feminist Studies, Lenape scholar Joanne Barker speaks of gendered categories and relationships to matrilineality and patrilineality, not necessarily indicative of matriarchy or patriarchy defined social identities, relationships and responsibilities in context of governance, territories and cultures. Lineality would seem to indicate an insistence on a biological relationship, but not one that can be used to stabilise gender and sexuality in the reckoning of social identity, desire and pleasure. These concepts of love and care are connected to curating as an act of care and sovereignty. For First Nations works, deep attention needs to be paid to curating for country and stories of country and all that comes with it, including trauma stories. Art that address previously silent stories is a gift to community and can be a way of writing back into academia and the arts world, which is predominantly white, and making new spaces and opportunities for reciprocity and potential for healing. In curating other Aboriginal people's work and my own, I care for and facilitate a process to place and protect that work in a context that is ethical, responsible, and respectful. An exhibition and academic writing provide a different experience for community members and a different one again for the academy and the art world. However, curating in Colony Australia is not oriented to such work. Despite museums and galleries having major and significant collections of Aboriginal art, artefacts and stories, the curators of these collections and managers, particularly senior ones, are almost still predominantly all white and non-Aboriginal people. Despite calls for Indigenous communities and collaborative projects, these projects and exhibitions usually have one-off or limited time spans, which often leave community members proud of their achievement when they're included, but suspicious of further engagement without permanent appointments, structural changes and shifts that see large teams or community groups or collaborative Aboriginal collectives working together in these spaces to curate them instead of singular appointments that really play into a Western way of being that doesn't serve our communities very well. Aboriginal art, so-called, has been kept and to some extent still gets kept separate by the Western canon and from contemporary art. It's still spoken about in binary terms as traditional or urban, i.e. authentic or not Aboriginal enough. Richard Bell argues that the advent of Aboriginal art is a white thing, accompanied by the exploitation of traditional artists. We don't see ourselves in major collections of contemporary art or in the Australian collections as such. Historically, and in some places, this is slowly changing in exhibitions, but not permanently, because we are categorised in the Aboriginal or Indigenous gallery. Few exceptions, including Tracy Moffat's work, the NGA, whose work is held in the Australian collections. I wonder if these galleries function as contemporary equivalents of last century's Aboriginal dioramas, where we're frozen in time, the same way that mid-century ashtrays and stilted Aboriginal kitsch objects, still produced and still found in tourist shops along Swanston Street in the city of Melbourne, maintain representations of us in 2021. The works of Aboriginal women writers such as Tucker, Langford, Genevieve, Lukashenko, Wright, and academics such as Linda Tway Smith, Decolonising Methodologies, Aileen Morton Robinson's Talking Up to the White Women, have begun to be read more widely. And there's a growing recognition of the major artistic bodies of work by Tracy Moffat, Brenda Alcroft, Destiny Deakin, Carla Dickens, and Lisa Bellaire's photographic archive and poetry collection, and the music of artists such as Titters and Titters member Lou Bennett, and their recent work with Romaine Morton and her 1 Million Beats performance, the work of the Bamali Artist Cooperative, founded by 10 Aboriginal artist activists, predominantly women, in Sydney in 1988, the work of the Proper Now Collective in Brisbane from 2003 on, predominantly men, with women though. There is the Burong Gallery at Bunjalaka, Aboriginal Cultural Centre at First Peoples Gallery at Melbourne Museum, and the work of more recent collectives such as Unbound Collective, Warriors of Aboriginal Resistance, and This One by Caitlin Buren, and curatorial projects by Kimberly Moulton, Back to the Future by Rosie Colina, and Fempress by Hannah Bronte in Brisbane. My work's in dialogue with each and all of these artists, writers, and collectives. It's situated in a decolonial, intersectional, Aboriginal, feminist, matriarchal, critically self-aware movement of sovereign political art that is responsive and responsible to ancestry, country, family, and communities. My work and my hope is that it positions the work of Aboriginal and Black women artists as visual authors of their lives and of the lives of their families and communities as collective memories of intergenerational relationships between predominantly Indigenous women, extended families and communities, as says Professor Aileen Morton Robinson in 2003. Aboriginal women are at the intersection of colonial injuries that include our gender, our race, our class and social positioning. And by subverting various forms of art and resistance in diverse contexts of community and the cross spaces like academia, public life and social media, Aboriginal women, Black women, create and recreate strategies to respond to and express survivance through visual sovereignty. Artists such as Moffat, Deakin and Dickens speak to me because of their clear disruptions to how Aboriginal women's art, community work and activism has been previously represented. In locally, particularly the work of Vicky Cousins and Marie Clark is especially influential to me. In particular, Destiny Deakin's series on Black urban identity dating from the 1990s allows me to speak to the complexity of what it means to be an urban living Aboriginal Black woman artist. And Lisa Bellaire's photographic work and poetry, in particular Dreaming in Urban Areas from 1996, is a critical example of how a biography is not always a written document, but can be presented in other ways. Lisa's photographic archive of around 20,000 images of the Victorian Aboriginal community and our life here is testament to Indigenous women's insider documentation of community collaborative practice. These approaches are decolonial, actually, or non-colonial, as the Métis artist and scholar David Gannell named it, and in practice, in art, community and activism. Activists find it necessary to make visible our resistance to being described and controlled by white Australia and its storytelling. And as Aboriginal writer Alexis Wright points out in her brilliant essay, What Happens When You Tell Someone Else's Story? We were not in charge of the national story about Aboriginal people when other people needed to create the narratives for the diorama in which we should exist, of how we should be visible in the eyes of Australia. Visual and performative arts have important roles here to play for constructing and reclaiming our story. Subversion is necessary to assert a visual sovereignty within art. Play is important, and as Alexis Wright also wrote, imagination is central to the meticulous struggle to be This is the weight that infiltrates everything we try to do, the burden in all the creativity, the handicap and vision. Thank you.